Thank you, Richard. We're going to have some probing questions for you, I think, later. Before I introduce Dr. Katz, I want to give you a sense, and Richard talked about it, where lawyers participated and actively participated, and I would suggest violated the rules of ethics during this process. And I'll tell you from a personal basis, my grandparents, great-grandparents lived in Arnstadt, and they had a lumber company, and they had a home that was the size about a block wide and a block deep, where they had some lumber in the back, but they also had a store. And part of the laws that were adopted were, of course, Jews couldn't own businesses, they couldn't operate businesses, and ultimately they couldn't own property. Now, the transfer of those things, just think about the concept of either the state taking your property or forcing you to give up your property. Today, if that happened in New Jersey, a lawyer would have to think twice about participating in that transaction. We have a duty today to third parties who are infirmed. Lawyers really can't participate in a transaction that's out of balance, out of whack, a forced sale of a house, executing a deed in that situation, putting on a mortgage in that situation. But here in Germany, in 1933, 34, 35, lawyers participated in those transactions and did not raise a voice. They participated on both sides of the transaction, sometimes representing their Jewish clients, sometimes representing the people who were getting the deal or the government getting the property. They were on both sides of the transaction, and neither side raised those issues and spoke to their clients and said, you know, this is not right. They did not go back to their own ethical rules and check themselves, and that's why we are where we are today. I'm going to ask Dr. Katz to come speak to us, who's going to talk a little bit about the ideology behind the Nuremberg laws. You've heard him speak already at dinner the other night. And Dr. Katz is in some ways all-knowing. And we're going to test that later today, but I look forward to your talk, Dr. Katz.
Thank you. Thank you. I have to tell you, I feel a little awkward. I'm not a lawyer. I'm married to an English barrister, and she tells me I should always have the last word in our discussions. Yes, dear. But the fact is, I have no special expertise. I'm a professor of Jewish studies and Holocaust studies at Boston University, and I'm really here pinch hitting because Erwin Cutler, a very, very distinguished member of your profession, former Attorney General in Canada, and a great fighter for civil rights, human rights all over the world, was unable to attend at the last minute. And so I'm stepping in, and I'm going to talk about something that I hope is relevant because you're all talking about the Holocaust. And therefore, it's not only the case that you need to know something about Nazi law, but you need to know something about Nazism and about the Third Reich and about where this all comes out. And I thought this morning I might talk a little bit about the ways in which people have tried to discuss, to deconstruct the Holocaust. Given the nature of such a complicated business, you have a lot of different theories, but the fact is that it's a multiple exercise. It's not monocausal, and that's the point I want to drive home at first. It's not just anti-Semitism, and that when you think about the Holocaust, you can't just think about Judophobia, the hatred of Jews. The fact is, of course, the dominant message emanating from Berlin, drawing on a long tradition of 2 millennia of Christian anti-Judaism, was that the Jewish people did not belong to the body politic in a normal way. And of course, that was adopted for their own reasons by many regimes, by Quisling in Norway, by various right-wing groups in Holland, by various politicians in Lithuania and Latvia and Estonia, by Romanian fascists. So it is certainly the case that anti-Semitism had widespread significance. But anti-Semitism will not explain everything that needs to be explained. The fact is that the different forces at work, Richard Heidemann has just talked about lawyers and individuals who did the wrong thing, didn't stand up to their obligations, and they didn't all do it because they were anti-Semites. Some did it out of self-interest, mentioned property. Some did it for professional advancement. If the man in front of you gets shot, there's a job opening. Some of it did it for financial advantage. Some did it simply for plunder under the protection of the law. Some did it for careerism, to get ahead. Some did it like judges and civil servants and bureaucrats and senior members of the Wehrmacht, not because they necessarily signed up as anti-Semites, but because they saw what side their bread was buttered on. So I want to stress that deconstructing the Shoah is a complicated business. Also for corporations like Siemens or Mercedes-Benz, IG Farben, the most outrageous example, Krupp, the munitions manufacturer, they didn't enter into this because they were anti-Semites, though they certainly manifest enormous anti-Semitism, but they were in this for profits and for the normal greed. Again, in society, bankers were greedy. You all know about the Swiss settlement with insurance companies. The insurance companies were not necessarily anti-Semitic, but they were Swiss corporations interested in making money. People who were professionals, like doctors and lawyers, saw various opportunities for self-advancement, independent of ideology. So one has to be careful not to fasten too quickly on a simplistic explanation of the Shoah. Also, you need to remember that the Shoah didn't happen just in Berlin. It was a continent-wide phenomenon that drew in essentially all the countries in Europe and all the actors in Europe, governmental actors, legal actors, judges, lawyers, and others. It took the military, of course, to persecute the Jews in the way that unfolded. It took the role of bureaucrats to pass out the various documents that said today you could leave the country, the next day that said you couldn't leave the country. It took technocrats to translate the bureaucrats into practical policy. It took doctors, lawyers. Doctors especially are important for you. They're overrepresented from the beginning in the SS. Very important for some reason to understand that Nazis seem to have been drawn to this idea that Jews were parasites, that they were a health menace, and that killing Jews was not an unethical violation, but in the redescription of ethics according to racial theory, they were the enemy in a public health attack. So killing Jews was a public health policy. It was not genocide. The policemen, the police officials, the members of the Einsatzgruppen, remember the members of the Einsatzgruppen were not volunteers. The 1,500 men who over 18 months killed 1.5 million people almost face to face every day were drafted, and nobody said no, even though they could have stepped away. So all of these factors need to be borne in mind. This was a very complicated structure with lots of actors. In addition, even anti-Semites didn't agree. For example, Italian anti-Semites didn't take seriously the anti-Semitic policy of Germany. Anti-Semites in other parts of Europe had their own idea of what a solution to the Jewish problem was. For many, it was simply disemancipation, the rejection, the overturning of the 150 years of progress since the French Revolution, but not Auschwitz. Also, you have to understand this phenomenon of Shoah. Richard, I think someone mentioned this morning 150 delegations that had come yesterday from all over, Brazil, Argentina, Sweden, I saw people, Costa Rica. So the fact is, people came from all over the world to participate. And you have to know that they had different agendas. France had a different agenda than Belgium. Belgium had its own agenda. Italy, Albania, Finland. If you look at the countries of Europe, you find something very, very interesting. France, which was rabidly anti-Semitic, after World War II, there was a joke, a sick joke that was told, if you had asked after World War I, or said after World War I, that the Jews of Europe would be murdered in the next 25 years, your response would have been, there's no telling to which the French will go. France was the center of anti-Semitism. I assume all of you know about the Dreyfus trial, but you should also know there were pogroms in France in the 19th century. There was a rabid right wing in France in the 19th century. But the fact is that France, even with Vichy, saved 85% of its Jews. And that's because France had its own agenda, which was not the same agenda as Himmler and as the Fuhrer. Essentially, France, and this turned out to be a peculiar thing, France's national egotism, for which France is so famous, seemed to say, we can hate the Jews, but who are you to hate our Jews? So 85% of the French Jews survived. In Belgium, 55% of the Jews survived because of the French underground and various activities I don't have time to describe. In Italy, Mussolini, who was Hitler's first partner, refused to deport the Jews. And the Jews were only deported from Italy after Mussolini's regime fell and the SS took over the running of Italy. And even then, the Catholic institutions, which are a very complex story, short of the Pope, all the other Catholic institutions were heroic. The Pope failed. But the fact is, this is an important thing to understand about the Shoah. You all know in Finland, there were 2,000 Jews. Finland were allies of the Nazis, official allies. They were worried about the Russians next door, so they sided with the Nazis. But when Himmler came to Finland to ask for the deportation of the Jews of Finland, the very heroic Prime Minister of Finland said, we have no Jewish problem in Finland. No Jews were deported. All the Jews of Finland were saved. In Denmark, where Hitler took a light touch because he thought they were the perfect Aryans, the Danish underground saved 7,200 out of 8,000 people in the famous rescue of the Jewish community. In Bulgaria, again, an ally, 50 of 57,000 Jews were saved, and here it was largely because of a parliamentarian, and a single parliamentarian, who rallied various forces, including the Orthodox Patriarch of Sofia, of the capital of Bulgaria. And I tell you this because you need to see that it's not just a simple question of who's an anti-Semite. In all these countries, you have anti-Semitic laws. Mussolini passed many anti-Semitic laws, and the new scholarship shows that there was worse than we thought in Italy, that there were terrible various policies in Vichy, but it didn't lead to Auschwitz. Alternatively, take a case that you all know, Netherlands, Holland. We tend to think that Holland was very good because they had a young woman named Anne Frank has provided them cover for 70 years. But the fact is, 80 to 85% of the Jews of Holland were murdered. That there was in Holland legions of the Wehrmacht and of the SS. That the chief of police in Amsterdam was a rabid anti-Semite who spared no effort to hunt down every single Jew. In Slovakia, you had a government headed by a Catholic priest named Tiso. He actually came to Himmler and said, take my Jews, I will pay for that. Not only will I pay for it, give you anything you want, but you have to give me a condition. They won't come back. So you have to understand the different conditions in which this all took place. In Hungary, the Horthy government saved the Jewish community, put them in forced brigades, but saved them from deportation till 44, and then the Horthy government fell. And you all know 437,000 Jews were deported in 56 days to Auschwitz, and 90% were murdered. Now, I tell you this just because, in a quick way, I apologize, but the fact is you should know that there's diversity, there's variety. To study this phenomenon, you have to look at lots of things. And it's not surprising for that reason that we have a lot of explanations. And it's also not surprising, given the nature of the Shoah, that the Holocaust generally makes a mockery of theories. Almost any theory that you think is universal turns out to be untrue when confronting all the diversity of the Shoah. And you see this with distinguished scholars. There was a very famous scholar at Princeton named Arno Mayer, very great international historian, but he got completely confounded, wrote a very bad book on the Holocaust, and he blamed it on Hitler's dislike of communism and modernity. But the reason Hitler didn't like modernity was because he didn't like Jews. He didn't like Jews because he didn't like modernity. He thought modernity had created Jewish emancipation, Jewish civil rights, Jewish integration. So he wanted to go back. You all have probably seen the Triumph of the Will, the film, the famous film with Leni Riefenstahl, Hitler's official photographer. Next time you watch it, of the Nuremberg rallies, I ask you to pay attention. You'll see that there are riding around Nuremberg people dressed as medieval knights on horses. So there was this backward-looking glance to an age when there were no Jewish citizens. Zygmunt Bauman, a distinguished sociologist, also gives us a Holocaust without anti-Semitism. It's all about modernity and technology. German historian named Goetz Ali, you should all know the name, writes a book almost every year with a different explanation, and it's always something other than anti-Semitism. One year it's surplus populations, one year it's greed, one year it's jealousy, but it's never anti-Semitism. Christian Gerlach, a very distinguished historian in Switzerland, thinks that it was a shortage of food. But of course that's a nonsense. There was no similar shortage of food in Western Europe where all the Jews annihilated. And also, if you have a food shortage, why single out the Jews to murder? Why not murder redheads? So the fact is that this all breaks down. And even my great friend and teacher, Al Hilberg, in his emphasis on bureaucracy and technology, and here you should all take a point, especially the students who I see in the back. Hilberg is the great figure in this discussion, places enormous emphasis on bureaucracy and technology, but the fact is you always have to keep in mind that technology and bureaucracy are always servants. They serve an ideological regime that puts them into practice, that energizes them. And therefore, we come back to questions about causation. And I want to tell you my own view, which of course is the right view. The fact is that there is not a monocausal explanation, one cause, anti-Semitism, but anti-Semitism, without a doubt, is the primary cause of the Shoah. And it's anti-Semitism of a very special kind. You shouldn't think of Nazi anti-Semitism primarily as biological. You should think of Nazi anti-Semitism as primarily metaphysical, ontological. The nature of the Jew in the universe of the Third Reich is not just that they have funny-looking features, that they have round heads, that they have black hair, but that they represent the incarnation of the forces of evil in the universe. Hitler himself said, people who think this is about race don't know anything about the Third Reich, about National Socialism. There is a whole metaphysical theory about who the Jew represents, what the Jew represents as the forces of evil. Blood is the mechanism by which the forces of universal evil make themselves present in time, but this is a metaphysical analysis. Secondly, I want to say that anti-Semitism here is not exclusive for the reasons I've mentioned, but it is primary. And those of you who are interested in really understanding this issue and looking for evidence of how to sort it out, I give you 8 major issues to think about. The first is that the authorization of the final solution came directly from the Fuhrer headquarters. We don't have a document. You all know there's no smoking gun, but it's almost certainly the case that in the fall of 1941, we have in Himmler's daybook 3 days that were blocked out in which Himmler spent intensive days, all-day-long sessions with the Fuhrer, and after that came the orders for the Wannsee Conference. It's almost certainly, in my opinion, the view that the victories in Russia were so extraordinary, the capture of 5 million Russian prisoners of war, the decimation of the entire Soviet Union in the western regions of the Soviet Union, encouraged Hitler to think this would be a short war and it would be a prelude to the murder of the Jews of Russia, millions of Jews in Belarus and the Ukraine. And of course, as part of that, they unleashed the Einsatzgruppen. So the phenomenon of the central authorization comes out of Berlin. It's not an accident. It doesn't happen because they needed some explanation here, some explanation there. Secondly, the Einsatzgruppen. I assume all of you know about the Einsatzgruppen. The Einsatzgruppen were created consciously in Berlin. And we have Heydrich going to talk to them before they go off. We know that they were told the ordinary rules of war did not apply, that they didn't have to pay attention to any kind of respect for civil society. 1,500 men were drafted. They were led by very educated types. Ohlendorf, who a famous trial of Einsatzgruppen leaders at Nuremberg that some of you will know as judges, as lawyers, was a man with a PhD in jurisprudence. One of the leaders of the Einsatzgruppen had worked for the evangelical office, the church office. One of the leaders of the Einsatzgruppen was an opera singer. All the members of the Einsatzgruppen were drafted. They weren't psychopaths. They were not given a Rorschach test to see who was particularly deranged. Thirdly, the Wannsee Conference. You all know the Wannsee Conference was planned for December 7, 1941. Something else happened on December 7, 1941 called Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor shifted the entire story of the war. They delayed the calling of the conference till January 20, where it was held in the home of a former Jewish home, a beautiful home in the suburb of Berlin. Göring and Himmler asked Heydrich to organize it. His assistant who kept the minutes was Adolf Eichmann. Took 91 minutes. And amazingly, there was no resistance to the announcement that the Fuhrer had decided on the Endlösung der Judenfrage in Europa, the final solution. The only debate at Wannsee was over Mischlinge, population that was half Jewish, half non-Jewish. What should happen to them? And that was a source of confusion right throughout the war. Fourth, you can't make any sense out of the Holocaust if you think it was functional, if it was just hit and miss, if it was just a mistake, by the creation of the ghettos. The Great Ghetto of Warsaw, which those of us who are on the CLE group will see on Sunday, at one point had 450,000 Jews, the largest ghetto in Europe. But you should know, and this is very important for you to know, that there were over 1,100 ghettos. People always know about Łódź, they know about Warsaw, they know about Białystok, perhaps they know about Vilna, Kovna, the major ghettos. But you should know there were over 1,100 ghettos. That doesn't happen without central planning, a central design, central organization. And of course, they forced all of these ghettos, to the degree they survived long enough, to adopt the strategy of work for life, which meant giving up the elderly, the children, and putting the Jewish leadership into opposition, in a sense, with their own population. A very remarkable phenomenon. Also in 1942, Himmler decided the ghettos had been around long enough. He gave an order in the summer that all the ghettos should be disbanded, liquidated. It was not possible to do that. There was some opposition from Speer and the Armaments Ministry. They needed some labor. So it took till 43. By the end of 43, essentially all the ghettos were dispersed, liquidated, except in Łódź. You all know Łódź lasted till August 44, and then it was the last to be dismantled, with the exception of Theresienstadt, which had a special status an hour from Prague. Also, you have a very curious thing that happened in the Third Reich and in the ghettos. You see it's a central policy of very considerable significance. Germany was short of labor. They drafted 7.5 million forced laborers from all over Europe, including over 1 million from Poland. They took hundreds of thousands from France. So you would have thought that confronted by Jewish victims, labor victims, they would use labor. 6 million Jews, altogether 9 million Jews in Europe. But they didn't do that. Consistently, there was a conflict between the armaments people, the production people, and Himmler. And almost without exception, Himmler won. The armaments people lost, except for a small plant in Czestochowa and one in Radom, and the Jews were liquidated. So, for example, the Warsaw Ghetto had been turned into a work camp, 450,000 Jews, but Himmler didn't care. He reduced and reduced and reduced over the summer of 42 until there were 60,000 people left during the uprising. He destroyed the Łódź Ghetto, taking off workers, especially at the beginning, female workers. And the fact is, repeatedly, and when they did use Jewish labor, as I mentioned the other night, more often than not, it was under a policy of Vernichten Deutsche Arbeit, killing through labor. Now, all of that did not happen by accident in all the different ghettos. The fact that it happened at IG Farben at Buna, the fact that it happened in the V2 rocket diggings in 1944, that it took place in the extraction of large ghettos, was central policy. So anti-Semitism was a crucial phenomenon. Seventh, I call to your attention the annihilation of Hungarian Jewry that I mentioned earlier. The last great Jewish community of Europe, they thought they had survived the war. It was already the spring of 1944. The Haughey government fell. A more fascist right-wing government took its place, invited Eichmann. Eichmann got a lot of assistance from Hungarian gendarmes, from various forces in the Hungarian state, managed to deport 437,000 people. Finally, the Hungarian government got nervous. They saw the war was coming to an end, so they demanded the end of the deportations, which was very fortunate. Otherwise, all 725,000 Jews probably would have been exterminated. And lastly, we hear to think about the March of the Living. Yesterday, we went to Auschwitz. Auschwitz was, of course, only one of 6 death camps. You mustn't confuse death camps with concentration camps. Death camps had only one purpose, by and large, except for Auschwitz, and that is the production of corpses. And that's what happened. Sobibor, 250,000 people, the number of survivors on one hand. Treblinka, 800,000 corpses in 18 months, a few dozen survivors. Chelmno, Belzec, Majdanek, all have rates of almost 100% murder. No children survive, no women survive, because the object is complete destruction of an entire people. Endlosing. Here in Auschwitz, of course, you have most of the people who do survive, small numbers, and that's because there was the Monowitz-Buna work site where a few Jews found refuge, and because of the heroism of the Jewish underground that blew up the crematoria 4 on October 6-7, 1944, and stopped gassing at the camp. All these projects, all of these decisions, all of these actions by Himmler and Hitler were the central activity of the Shoah. Not the only activity. And there's no doubt that people throughout the German Reich, to use a phrase by the distinguished historian Ian Kershaw, worked towards the Fuhrer. It's a very nice phrase. Work towards the Fuhrer. Working towards the Fuhrer meant trying to anticipate what he would like and doing it in advance. So people knew about his anti-Semitism, so of course they got on the bandwagon and they tried to pursue anti-Semitic policies that would further his cause and their status within his universe. So these remarks only to introduce you to a very large issue. I want to say one other thing. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not an expert on Nazi law, but these ideas of the Fuhrer are central in Nazi law. Nazi law is fundamentally defined by a reorientation of the meaning of the law. The law is not any longer a Rechtsstaat. is not any longer the normal procedures of the court with all of its checks and balances, the restraint on the judge, etc. Nazi law is essentially the transformation of the law into an instrument of the Führer. That if you look at all of the propositions advanced by Göring in a famous 1935 interview with the New York Times after the passage of the Nuremberg laws, he explained that the law is the Führer, that the law and the Führer are one, and that the Führer principle is the determining legal principle. The Führer principle is not sufficiently discussed by legal historians or even general historians. The Führer principle says that the Führer can do no wrong. He's above all positive law. He's the intuitive force by which universal rule, natural law, ordinary principles make themselves felt. And therefore, the German courts were in a position to disregard all of the traditions that we usually think of as belonging to a normal legal state. In the late 30s, the courts repeatedly used that to enforce rules of Rassenschande, racial crimes, sexual get-togethers between Jews and Aryans. They used it to cancel contracts by the definition that the Jews a priori are criminals. Has nothing to do with the legal definition, has to do with a metaphysical definition. Jews by nature are criminals. And then, of course, in Poland and Eastern Europe, they defined the situation where there was no law except dictates. No law except the will of the sovereign power. No restriction, no restraint, no judicial hearings that allowed for cross-questioning, lawyers, all the things that you're all expert in. So these issues are not incidental to your study and to my study. The Holocaust is a very complicated business. Thank you.